I'm Tony Northup, and this is my free tutorial for the Hasselblad X1D-50C. If you have this camera, I'm going to walk you through the main things that you need to know, but I'm going to assume that you've used other cameras before, and this probably isn't your first camera, right? So I'm going to focus mostly on the weird little quirks that you'll need to know if you're going to actually get some good results with this. First, please subscribe to this channel. We have lots of camera tutorials, photography tutorials, camera reviews, and just lots of fun stuff. And every Thursday at 5 o'clock, we look at your pictures live. If you have a different camera, if you want to send your friends a similar tutorial, send them to sdp.io/tutorials, where you'll see more than 30 tutorials for just about all the popular cameras. First of all, the battery on this camera is a little bit weird. When you want to take it out, you'll flip this little switch like that and it will pop out, but then you have to tap it again and then it will click. So when you put it in, make sure the contacts are towards the middle of the camera, push it in until it clicks, and then you can push this and it won't come out. It's still locked. You need an extra little tap. That's just so that if this accidentally gets hit when you're walking around, the battery doesn't just fall out. That's it. I will say the battery life is short. You should probably get yourself an extra battery. It is not USB chargeable. You can hook it up to USB and power it if it's a real pinch and you don't have a battery, but carry a couple extra batteries with you. On the other side here, we have dual memory card slots. You'll pull the little Hasselblad logo back towards you and it will spring open. It's backwards, it feels backwards. The slot near the lens is slot 1. The slot towards the back of the camera is slot 2. Doesn't really matter what you use, but most of the time you'll be using the primary slot. Whenever possible, SD cards can fail, so I would suggest putting one card in both slots. Close that back up. This camera does not support what's called the UHS-2 SD card standard. UHS-2 cards are much faster, but they're also more expensive. Therefore, you don't need to spend your money on a UHS-2 card. Instead, just get a standard UHS-1 card. UHS-2 cards will work, but you're paying for something you're not using. I suggest getting the SanDisk Extreme Pro card. That sdp.io link will take you there. 64 gigs is okay. I would go ahead and get 128 or 256 gigs because these 50 megapixel RAW files are huge. Another tip, buy a bunch of cheap SD cards, like a dozen of them, and scatter them throughout your life. Put them in your glove box, in your purse, in the bag that you travel with, in your office desk, wherever you might be, because inevitably at some point in your life, you're gonna forget an SD card and you're going to need it. You can pause this. Here's a full testimony from somebody who I saved. Oh, and here's somebody else that didn't follow my advice and ended up missing out on an entire shoot. So please go back to sdp.io/cheapsd and get yourself some cards. The firmware on this camera, Hasselblad has been great about updating it on a regular basis. The firmware is all the software that it runs, how all the features work. So the camera over the last 2 years has gotten better and better. There might be a firmware update out since I've recorded this. So make sure you go to Hasselblad's website, find the latest firmware and update it because the camera will actually get better. The power button here, it is real weird. It does not work like a normal camera. This is my first quirk. First, to make sure the camera is actually off, you look for a little light here. There's no light here. That means the camera is not on, it is not in standby, but it is in off mode. To turn the camera on from that state, you will hold the power button down for a second or so. You'll feel it kick on. You'll see the Hasselblad logo come up. Now we have an orange light here. It's blinking, and it takes a long time to start up. Okay, so now it's finally up, and pretty soon now we'll be ready to shoot. Okay, when it's green, you should be able to shoot, put the camera to your eye, half press the shutter button. That on and off are two of the power states. The third power state is standby mode. If you don't touch the camera for long enough, it will go into standby mode, saving some power, but not taking quite as long to start up. If you want to manually put it in standby mode, just push this power button once. The green light turns to orange, and now it is in standby mode. When I want to come out of standby mode, I don't hold this down for a couple of seconds, I just push it once. Kind of confusing, but that's how the power states work. There are a couple of USB ports on this side. Flip open the compartment on the left side and you get access to the ports. This is the USB-C port. You can use that for tethering at very high speeds, for transferring images to your computer if you don't want to use a separate SD card reader, or you can power the camera from a USB-C power supply of some kind. Again, you cannot charge the battery from it. This port up here is a mini HDMI port. If for some reason you wanted to hook it up to a field monitor or a TV, you could use that. You'll probably never use that. It's not that useful. And then you will see the lower port here is a headphone jack, and this is a mic jack for recording in case you decided to use this for a video camera. I would not advise that. It is not a very efficient video camera. You'd probably get better results with your smartphone. Let's talk about taking a picture here. This has a rear screen and an electronic viewfinder up here. It should switch between them automatically. So if I hold it to my eye, it will switch up here. There's a little bit of a lag as you kind of go through that switch. If you're looking at the screen and you don't see live view, you might just have to half push the shutter button to get it to pop up. Half push the shutter button to focus and then push it all the way to take a picture. You have two different shutter modes, single shutter and continuous shutter. You can change them. Notice that I'm pulling up the menu system here by swiping down on the screen. I don't know of another camera like this. It works almost like Snapchat or something. It's very modern. This little button down here switches between single shutter and continuous shutter. So that's where that is. I was using autofocus. You can switch to manual focus up here. There is no continuous focus, just single autofocus and manual focus. I want to warn you that the shutter here is slow. The first time my daughter used it to take a picture, she tried to take a picture and she said, the person has a different face than when I took the picture. That's because there's like half a second delay and nobody's really used to that. So you're not going to be shooting any kind of action with this camera. If you're doing a portrait shoot, instead of being like, usually when you're shooting a model, it's like very fast paced, at least my style, where it's like shoot, pose, you'll have to kind of carefully pose them, have them freeze and hold still for a second, and then take the picture. And then after the shutter finally clicks, they can move. But because of that extra delay, it can throw off the workflow, the kind of meter of a photo shoot. So it's something to really be aware of and to kind of plan around. You have to be very deliberate with this camera. When you're using the electronic viewfinder, I mentioned it'll automatically switch. You might have to wake it up by half pushing the shutter. You can adjust the diopter here to dial in your glasses prescription. This is the diopter. It's this dial here on the electronic viewfinder. If your vision isn't perfect, or if you'd like to take off your glasses while you're wearing it, hold the camera up to your eye and then look at the numbers on the bottom of the screen. Don't look through the lens. Look at the numbers and dial that in until you get the best possible vision. If this gets hit accidentally, your camera will seem like it won't focus properly. So if you're looking at things and it's not focusing, be sure to look at those numbers. And if the numbers are out of focus, then the problem is the diopter. You need to adjust that. Sometimes it can get hit accidentally. Sometimes somebody else will pick up your camera and they'll have a different prescription and they'll need to change it. The touchscreen here is a very important part of this. I demonstrated it already, but swiping and touching are two key elements. So swiping down will bring up the main information screen here. You can touch any of these elements to switch between them. There's white balance. These are the different metering modes. You can change the ISO right here. You can do some of these with buttons too. They're pretty obviously labeled, so I'll let you figure that out. That's how you use the touchscreen. If you want to get to the camera settings, notice I just swiped up from the bottom and there they are. They're grouped into three main groups: cameras, swipe to the left to get back, video, swipe to the left, and general settings, swipe to the left to get out of that. That's about what there is to know. It operates much more like a smartphone than a typical camera that you might be accustomed to. Let's talk about the focusing points. I use single autofocus on this while you're looking through it. Most cameras, if you want to move the focusing point around, there's a thumbstick. This works a little bit differently. While I have the camera to my eye, I'm going to drag my thumb over this corner of the touchscreen. So let me try to demonstrate that. So as I do that, I'm moving the focusing point all around. If you're into back button focus, do this. Set the camera to manual mode, swiping down, switching to manual mode, and now the AFL button will act as your back button focus. You can see as I push that, it's activated. And in manual mode, it will not try to autofocus when you have to press a shutter. That's all there is to it. It's actually the easiest camera to set up back button focus on. This camera has a depth of field preview, but it is not on by default. Some mirrorless cameras, if you dial the f-stop up to f8 or something, you'll automatically see it in the viewfinder. That is not the case with this camera. This camera operates more like an SLR. The depth of field preview button, if you use a higher than normal f-stop, will shut the aperture down so you can preview the effects, see just how sharp the background is going to be. To push the depth of field preview button, you'll see it's right here below the lens. This is the lens release button. This is the depth of field preview button. So while you're looking through it, you'll only notice this if you're using a fairly high f-stop number. So let's get this up to like f32. If you look at the chair in the background here, the camera is focused on the computer. If you look at the chair in the background, when I hit the depth of field preview button, it's going to lock in at f32, shutting down that aperture and giving me a preview of how much depth of field I'm going to get. That's really useful. It means you don't have to take a picture and actually review it, so get to know where that is. This camera has an optional GPS module. Here it is. It's very cool. It slides right into the hot shoe, and assuming you can get some satellites, like all you do is you plug it in there. Burns a little bit of extra battery, but it talks to the GPS satellites around the world and will actually add location information to your pictures. If you go into Adobe Lightroom, which we use to process pictures, you can click the map module and you'll be able to see where you took your pictures. It's cool. I keep the GPS module in there all the time, but it does slip off a lot. So just be aware, because you don't want to lose it. One quirk about changing modes on this camera, when you put it into manual mode, auto ISO goes away. You have auto ISO options in aperture, shutter priority, program mode, everything except manual mode. You can only manually select an ISO. It's just a quirk. Every other camera in the world, every modern camera can do that. This one cannot. Bulb mode is really nice on this camera. There are two different ways you can activate long exposures. First, get yourself into manual mode. Adjust your aperture to whatever you want to be. On most cameras, the maximum shutter speed is 30 seconds. But look what happens when I roll the shutter speed past 30 seconds. Look, there I'm at 4 minutes, 24 minutes, 1 hour. This camera will take 1 hour photos. I don't know why every camera in the world doesn't do this. They should. Thank you, Hasselblad, for doing that. There's one other way to do long exposures. If I scroll back, this is a real weird quirk, but if I scroll between 1 second and 1.4 seconds, you'll see there's a bulb mode and a T mode, a timer mode. The bulb mode would be used if you use an external shutter trigger. There's no reason to really use that ever. Instead, we'll either set it manually or we'll use the T mode here. The T mode opens the shutter when you push the shutter button, and it stays open until you push this button. So you could do a 40-minute exposure by just telling Siri to remind you in 40 minutes and then go back and manually push that button. I'm gonna take a brief moment and plug my stuff. Hey, you bought $10,000 camera and lens. You can probably spend 10 bucks on my book, Studying Digital Photography. It's super cheap. It's the #1 photography book in the world and has 14 hours of video. You can also get books on Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop to help you with the post-processing and organizing of your images. And if you really want to know everything about all the intricacies of things like what a leaf shutter is, check out my photography buying guide. My Art and Science of Photography deal, that's a little more expensive, but hey, you got the cash, right? I know what's going on over there. Check out Art and Science. It'll take your photography to the next level, going deeper than any YouTube videos possibly will. You can get it all at Amazon, search for Tony Northrup and check out the reviews, or get it directly from us at sdp.io/store. The Reciprocal Rule. You might be familiar with it. It says that your shutter speed when hand holding should be 1 over the focal length. This does not apply to a 50 megapixel unstabilized camera. It is very easy to get camera shake with this camera. It depends on your own personal biology, how shaky your hands are, but if you are using this 45mm lens and you try to hand hold at 1/45, you're probably going to get some camera shake because the lenses are super sharp. The sensor is very high resolution, so it's going to show off those movements more than other cameras would. You will have to learn what you need. You might need to be at twice the reciprocal rule. You might need to be at 4 times the reciprocal rule. In other words, much faster shutter speeds than necessary. I would suggest you keep it in continuous shutter. Anytime you take a picture, you take 4, 5, and then you will be able to pick one of those shots, and hopefully out of those, one of them is going to be a little bit sharper than normal. You might also plan to travel with a tripod and use it whenever possible, because you will definitely notice sharpness improvements when using a tripod. The metering system on this camera I showed you earlier. You can push this on the screen to change the metering between center weighted, spot metering, and center spot. If you are familiar with those different methods from the old film days, good for you. These systems are all very primitive compared to any other modern camera, and as a result, I found a lot of pictures that were not properly exposed when I was relying on auto exposure. You know, if you're using a Nikon, it'll actually find the face in the scene and make sure that the face is properly exposed. This won't do it. It is not detecting anything in an intelligent way. It is just averaging the light that it sees coming in from all over the frame. So just be very aware of that. You need to be constantly adjusting your exposure compensation up or down to get the proper exposure, or you need to be in manual mode and doing everything manually. I'll show you how to get the exposure compensation. On the back screen here, you can see it's right there. So now I can adjust the exposure compensation up or down. Well, this up here is the flash exposure compensation. That's a little tricky. It's the one on the bottom here. This is the one you need to adjust to +5 or -5 just to get the right brightness out of it. The color on the saturation, if you're shooting JPEG, you are going to get flat pictures, and that is just the Hasselblad way. They hand everything to you very neutral and allow you to amp it up if you want to. So if you were to compare it against your Canon, Nikon, Sony, it would be like, why are these pictures so low contrast and so boring? That's the way the JPEGs are. If you are shooting RAW and processing in something like Adobe Lightroom, Adobe will take those RAW files and try to make them look exactly the same as every other camera. So it's not even a concern if you're shooting RAW. Again, if you are shooting JPEG, know that you're probably going to want to go in and up the contrast and saturation to be happy with it. This is a medium format camera. It has a big sensor, quite a bit bigger than typical full frame cameras. The crop factor, measured diagonally, is 0.79. Sensors that are bigger than full frame have crop factors that are less than 1. That means if you are used to shooting full frame and you want to understand the results that you're going to get out of it compared to it, you would take the focal length and multiply it by 0.79. You would also take the aperture and multiply it by 0.79 in order to understand the total light gathering and the depth of field that you would see. This means that all the primes right now are f3.5. That means they're roughly equivalent to f2.8 35mm lenses as far as how much background blur you're going to get. That is measured diagonally. If you are an 8x10 shooter, 8x10 shots on a full frame camera require cropping off an inch off of both the left and the right. That's getting rid of a lot of precious data from a full frame camera. If you're shooting for an 8x10 format, the crop factor is 0.53, so about half. That'll just give you some sense for what the actual focal length is going to be. If you don't have a deep understanding of crop factor and you are interested in it, if you're coming from a different size sensor, this can really help orient you to the types of results that you'll get with these medium format lenses. Visit this free link, sdp.io/crop. These lenses have a leaf shutter. The leaf shutter is distinctly different from the focal plane shutter that you will find in almost every other modern camera. Focal plane shutters are located right next to the sensor, right in front of the sensor. They just come down like a curtain anytime that you're taking a picture. Well, they actually move away when you're taking a picture. The leaf shutter is different. The leaf shutter is located in the lens, right next to the aperture. It's not the aperture, it's separate, and it comes in from all different sides and kind of squeezes in. This means a few different things. First of all, it prevents you from using very high shutter speeds. That limits this camera to 1/2000th of a second as the maximum shutter speed. So yeah, you're not going to be at 1/32,000th of a second like you would with some other cameras. The benefit of it is it means you never have to use high-speed sync on your strobes. So if you're shooting outside in full sunlight, you can shoot at 1/2000th of a second and not have to turn on high-speed sync. You can use Nikon flashes with this, by the way. Another weird quirk of it is that it gives you really odd bokeh. The quality of the background blur is never going to be perfectly round. Even when you're shooting wide open, you're going to see angles to out of focus highlights. So for example, if you're shooting in a city at night and there are city lights behind your model, the bokeh is not going to be round. It's always going to be sort of hexagonal. It's the leaf shutter. That is the Hasselblad way, so get on board. As I mentioned, the flash system is compatible with Nikon, including for TTL. I personally have not tried TTL. I don't generally use TTL. I just do flash manually. I have used Nikon flashes. They seem to work great. So buy yourself some Nikon flashes. Let's talk about reviewing pictures here. I have some pictures on this camera from earlier. Hit the play button to review your pictures. Hit this little square here and it will iterate through between different types of information about the picture. So you can see as I push it, I can view my histograms, my settings, or I can just view the picture full screen. Zoom in just like you would on a smartphone. Oh, look at that. I just took a picture for this example and it's all camera shaky. Remember when I was telling you how hard it is to get steady pictures without image stabilization on this thing? So anyway, Justin looks a little shaky, but you can see it's a very responsive touchscreen. If you want to flip between pictures, you can either squeeze back like that until you see the thumbnails and then you can look at a different picture, or you can just flip side to side like that. That's most of it. I just wanted to quickly walk you through some of the basic settings that are available in here. Again, to pull up the menu, swipe up from the bottom, or you can hit this little button down here. You'll see, when you bring this up, you'll see a bunch of shortcuts here on the left. This 3x3 block are shortcuts to settings that are available under these three main categories on the left. So think of these as tabs. These are just shortcuts. So these are all duplicated. First, we'll start with the camera settings here. You can see all these different groups. I'm just going to walk you through them real quickly so you are familiar with where things are. Under the exposure, you can change your increment size and step. You don't really need to do that. I would always leave the true shutter on. The electronic shutter means you're not using the physical shutter, and I generally like using the leaf shutter, but that's where it is if you want to turn that on. Under quality, you can choose RAW or RAW plus JPEG. Yes, that's right. The Hasselblad does not give you the option to just shoot JPEG. I guess they're like, why did you buy a Hasselblad if you're going to be shooting JPEG? Under autofocus, we have a couple of options here. You can change the size of your autofocus point. Generally, smaller size points are going to be a little more precise. You can see you have the option to have it reset to, say, the center autofocus point. You can turn on the autofocus assist light in dim lighting. It will light up this little red light here, cast some light on your subject, or perhaps distract them. If you're trying to be discreet and shooting at night and you don't want to disturb people, you should turn that off. Otherwise, it might help your focusing a little bit. Under manual focus here, you have the option for focus peaking. I have that on. There are other ways to manually assist. You can automatically zoom in as soon as you start turning the focusing ring, or you can have it do neither of those things. On this camera, I generally leave focus peaking on. I like that little bit of assurance that I have gotten focus. Even when I'm autofocusing, with the back button focus turned on, I'm technically in manual focus mode, so I see the focus peaking all the time. I'm happy with that, but maybe you are doing something a little bit different. You can see here, you can also change the peaking color if you happen to be using focus peaking. If you want to manually set your white balance, you can see the white balance tool will allow you to do that. Take a picture first, and then pick the point that you want to set as true white, and then click set. You'll typically take a picture of a white card or a gray card before you do that. The self-timer is very useful. If you're shooting on a tripod, you should turn the self-timer on, because simply the process of pressing the shutter is going to shake the camera a little bit. And with this 50 megapixel sensor, you will notice a difference. Therefore, if you're on a tripod, get in here and turn on the self-timer by selecting the active checkbox here. You can see you can set a different type of delay. 2 seconds is usually enough if you're just on a tripod. If you're doing the thing where you put the camera in a tripod and you're taking a picture of family, you want to run around and join the picture, then yeah, you're probably going to need it like 8 seconds or something. But I typically leave that at 2 seconds. If you wanted to automatically exit the self-timer, if you just want to get one shot with the self-timer, you could set that to exit, but usually I just go in and manually turn it off when I'm done anyway. Get out of there. Interval timer, if you want to make yourself a 50 megapixel time lapse, yes, that's right, you could do an 8K time lapse with this. Come in here, select active, and then select the total amount of time, the number of frames, the initial delay, and whether you want to turn the time lapse off or not when you're done. Bracketing allows you to take multiple frames at different exposures, one properly exposed, one underexposed, and one overexposed. Check that checkbox to turn it on. Change the difference in stops between the frames. I don't see any reasons to not do like 3 stops with this. Select whether you want to do 3 frames, 5 frames or more. Usually 3 frames at 3 stops is going to get all the dynamic range in the scene if you're stacking images for HDR. If you want to be really safe, 5, but I've never seen a scene where you would need to do like 7 or 9. That would require a lot of dynamic range. And then at the bottom, if you just want to take one shot bracketed, you could set this to exit. The rest of those you probably won't need to use. You do have the option to customize some of the buttons. For example, you might not want, you might always change the ISO using the rear screen, so therefore I have set it to zoom in. I have the AF/MF button up here set to turn on the spirit level. You can play with those and customize them depending on how you use it, just to give yourself shortcuts to the settings that you use the most. Under the last option here, configuration, there are some useful settings. For example, you can change the auto ISO limits. There's no reason not to have it go all the way up to the maximum auto ISO and to the minimum ISO. You can set a minimum shutter speed when you're in auto ISO in program mode. This last option here, max aperture, you can set this to full to give yourself more circular bokeh. So when you set it to full, you're choosing rounder bokeh but you're deviating slightly from what the camera designers had actually intended. The video settings here, this video is pretty limited. You can change the resolution to 720, but that's it. And for live view, you can see you can overlay a grid. Those are all those settings. You'll probably never change either of them. Let's go back to the general settings here. You can see this camera does support a Wi-Fi app. I'm not going to walk you through that, but this is where you would turn Wi-Fi on and then open up the Hasselblad app and follow the instructions. It does work. It works just fine. I've transferred images with it. You can use the display settings here to adjust the brightness of the screen, turn on or off exposure simulation. Exposure simulation previews how bright or dark the image is going to be. So it works more like a mirrorless camera. If you turn this off, it will work more like a traditional DSLR where you just always see the brightness of the outside scene regardless of what your actual settings are. I leave exposure simulation on. For live view, you can see you can turn off live view of the scene. If you always use the viewfinder and you want it to behave like that, just select the EVF only checkbox. And after you take a picture, if you want the image preview to pop up on the rear screen, select that checkbox there. If you also want to see the preview in the electronic viewfinder through here, you can select how long you want the image to be previewed on the rear screen. I generally, if I'm using the viewfinder, I don't want to see the picture I just took most of the time because it would throw off my flow. So I leave that turned off. And in fact, I'd rather just hit the play button than have it automatically pop up. The overexposure warning will basically turn on blinkies if a picture is going to be overexposed. Parts of a picture are going to be overexposed if you're blowing out the highlights on something. So select that if you want that little bit of extra warning. The touch icon here gives you a little bit of control over how the touchscreen works. I like to be able to move the touchscreen using my thumb here, so I have that checkbox selected. You can also use the touchscreen for image browsing, as I showed you. I have that checkbox selected. Touchpad for HDMI only applies when you're using an HDMI cable, which you'll probably never do. Custom modes allows you to save whatever your current settings are, things like shutter speed and aperture, to one of the C1, C2, or C3 modes on this camera. So if you have it set up for portraits, you could set that to C1, landscapes C2, and then quickly switch between them. Storage allows you to format your SD cards, SD card 1 or 2. Don't get them confused. Remember, SD card 1 is the one that's further closer to the lens. Destination allows you to choose your primary slot, which should probably be SD1, and then choose whether the second card is used for overflow or backup. If you're worried about an SD card failing, which you should be, put 2 cards in it and then set it to backup and it will write to both cards simultaneously. That way you won't lose any pictures if an SD card fails. For sound, you can see, you can change the volume of everything. I generally want my cameras to be silent, so you could turn that off. You can turn on sounds when you do a key click, or have it beep for an exposure warning, or have it beep when it's ready. But generally, for me, my taste is to turn all that off. Date and time obviously allows you to set your date and time. Power and timeouts allow you to determine how long it takes before the display turns off. So if it's shutting off too quickly and that's annoying you, get in there and turn that up. It will automatically power off completely after 30 minutes. If you are the type who wants to save battery and you never remember to actually turn it off, then go in and set this to something much shorter, knowing that the next time you pick the camera up, you'll actually have to hold that button down and wait for the whole startup process. Spirit level here is just a good way to make sure that your camera is actually level. You can see, there we go. It works well. If you have the camera on a tripod, if you're taking a landscape shot, I highly recommend pulling that up. You might have noticed that I programmed my AF button to do that, so I can just push the AF button at any time to actually see the spirit level. Language, service, and about are all pretty obvious, and you probably never need to go into those. That wraps it up. If you want Lightroom and Photoshop, I can get you a deal. Go to sdp.io/Adobe deal, and you'll get a free trial of both of those programs. You got to organize and edit your photos somehow. And once again, I'll plug my own stuff, Stunning Digital Photography, my photography technique that teaches storytelling, mood, composition, those things that will really make a difference in your photos. The ebook is only $9.99. The paperback is a little bit more, but they both include 14 hours of video. It's definitely the best bargain in the photography industry. I also have books on Lightroom and Photoshop, and check out my Art and Science of Photography video training series, which is more. It's like $200, but it's worth it. It takes your photography to the next level by getting more intense than anything you will be able to find on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe. If you have follow-up tips about the camera based on your own experience or follow-up questions, add a comment down below. Bye.